Testing, testing. Is it working?
No, it's active.
Is this thing even proper? I hope that's good enough. Okay.
Well, no, we were thinking just the back row there. Only because you know how everybody will love to look at Sophia, and I want to keep somewhat of your attention as we.
Oh no, that's not necessary.
Hi guys, we're here too. We're here too.
And then if you need to like step or do whatever, you can kind of step and walk without having to come from the front. You know? We know how these things go.
Yes, if you've been to Mass with her, you know how it goes.
Okay, so first off, just thank you for your flexibility. We know we kind of made a little curveball here last second, but we want to give you time if you do something later on for the national championship game, because you have freedom to do that. So we're here now in round 2 of our Hungry for More. And so we had general intro to theology of the body, which he's very happy about. And now we have a kind of dating and chastity. How do we date chastely? What does that look like? So what better group to do that than a married couple or a young married couple? And we see what chastity looks like.
Chastity's beautiful, guys.
Chastity is beautiful. Chastity is beautiful.
Yeah.
But we'll kind of jump into that before we start. Let's start with the prayer. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Heavenly Father, we give you thanks for the beautiful gift of family. We give you thanks for our sexuality. We give you thanks for our bodies, our souls, Lord, that we are a human person made in your image and likeness. Lord, help us to always endeavor to understand what that means, how it is that we can grow closer to you in that understanding, Lord. Help us always with the strength and will to carry out your will in our life. We ask this through Christ our Lord.
Amen.
In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. So there's not much intro I need to give here. This is an easy one. Jojo and Emily, you've seen around, you know Queen Sophia. So I'm just going to hand it over and let these two take it from there.
Sure.
We'll have Q&A at the end, as usual.
Okay. Well, thank you guys for having us. We're excited to be here. Obviously, this is a very exciting opportunity just to take some time on a Sunday afternoon and sort of discuss some things that are on everybody's mind, particularly at this time in your guys' life. We're hoping that just by sharing some of our personal experiences and our story, we'll give you guys maybe some useful tips, things that we've learned along the way, mistakes that we've made, maybe things we would have liked to have done better, and hopefully you guys can come away today with a few practical things, and then also maybe some things to think about and to spark further discussion, you know, with your friends, with Father, and if any of you are in relationships with your significant others. So we'll start kind of with our story a little bit. For those of you who were at the Focus Talk a few months ago, I had shared a little bit. I'm not too sure how many of you made it there, but we are both graduates from Franciscan University. And I'll start a little bit from my end. So I was born and raised Catholic. I had my conversion at the age of 17. I was not living a very Catholic life at the time. I lost my virginity at the age of 17. I began discerning the priesthood for about 2 years, which is why I ended up at Franciscan. They have a discernment program there. And after 2 years, I went abroad to Austria, their Austrian program, and I walked the Camino del Santiago, the way of St. James in Spain, for a summer. And it was then that I felt the call and the push towards marriage. I had a few what I'd call very religious experiences, and probably the only very few times in my life that I've actually had experiences like that. So came back to the States and I started dating very intentionally. I hadn't dated anybody since I was 17, so about 3 years I was out of practice. But I began very intentionally, so I had that goal in mind of marriage, and that's where I started from. So anytime I asked a girl out, anytime I went on a date, and I thought that there was something here, I made that intention very clear. I made a lot of mistakes along the way, but you know, the first date I would let them know, like, hey, I'm dating for marriage, and if that's not where you're at, that's perfectly okay. You know, I'd still love to get to know you a little bit more and see where this goes. But then 2 years later, in 2018, I met Emily during the summer after having just broken up with somebody, and within the first 3 weeks, I knew she was the one. So it was pretty fast for me, and like
I needed a little convincing, but
yeah.
I got there.
Obviously. And so we were dating for 6 months before we began talking seriously about marriage. The topic had come up, but we wanted to give ourselves some time just to meet our families and to get to know each other. And then by the 9th month, we were engaged. And that was partly my fault. I had told her, or I had suggested that it would be kind of late summer, early fall was kind of the time frame I was thinking for proposing.
I was convinced it was coming like 6 months later.
Yeah. So April 18th of 2019, I proposed on her birthday before we were heading back to her house for Easter, so we celebrated with her family, and it was great. One little detail I forgot to mention, in 2016, that's when I was walking the Camino, and when I felt the call to discern marriage, to really seek that out intentionally, I started writing letters to my future spouse. So about once a month, or if I was just unsuccessful kind of in my dating, if I was just feeling down too, it's kind of sappy and sobby, a lot of them, but they were just like, oh, this girl broke up with me, and oh, I just feel so like, when am I going to find you? So 2016, June 12th was the first letter I wrote. That's when it was dated, for June 12th, 2016. In the summer of 2020, we got married on June 12th. The first time Emily and I went on a date, when I asked her out for a date, was June 12th, 2018.
Yeah, we found all that out like, I don't know, a few days after we got married.
After we got married,
yeah, when he gave me the letters on our honeymoon.
So it was 2 years between kind of when I began discerning marriage and writing those letters, and then 2 years when we started dating, and then exactly 2 years to when we got married. So completely accidental. I hadn't looked at those letters. I was scared to since I started writing them, and then on our wedding night, I gave them to her to read. So that's a little bit of my story, my side of things. I have a lot of experience in making mistakes and messing up, and I've learned a lot, so I have a lot of thoughts about this topic.
Yeah, so I'll just kind of give my spiel, and then we'll talk about what chastity looked like for us in like different stages of our relationship. But I was homeschooled growing up, so needless to say, I didn't date in high school, really not a lot of options. And then throughout the first 3 years of college, I went on a lot of first dates. I went on the occasional second date. Usually didn't make it that far. I would know pretty early on if this person was someone I was interested in like continuing to pursue a relationship with. Just as like a side dating tip, I would really encourage you guys to like think about the standards that you would have for the other person, but think of them in terms of standards that you set for yourself. So I called them my non-negotiables, and they really helped me kind of like guide me in the dating process. So for me, it was like at least striving for these things, right? Like daily mass, daily prayer. We were in school, so commitment to, trying your best in school, taking care of themselves like physically and stuff, eating well, exercising, were all really important to me. This is going to be happening on and off, guys, so sorry. And so, within like a couple of dates, I'd be able to see, okay, this person, like the way that they live out their faith, maybe they just go to Sunday Mass. And for me, like it's important that they're helping me strive in my faith. So I don't know if this is going to work, or man, this guy like eats at Taco Bell 3 times a week. Like, I don't think this is going to work out, So I don't know, little things like that. And so when I met Jojo, he was the first guy I dated who really like met all of those standards that I had set for myself and then some, except he did eat a lot of carbs. So at first I was unsure, but we're still here. So
I just ate a whole loaf of bread before we got here, so nothing changed.
But no, and that really like helped me in the discernment process. Yeah, so, oh gosh, now I've lost my train of thought. So part of the reason why maybe like I only went on 1 or 2 dates with a guy was largely because of those standards, but also it's like something that I want to touch on that I think is really important in relationships is this idea of emotional chastity. It's like a term that's thrown around a bunch, but there were like 1 or 2 guys in undergrad that I did not practice emotional chastity with. And what that looks like is I would spend an inordinate amount of time one-on-one with them, like innocently, right? Just studying for hours or texting regularly. They're always checking in, like, how are you doing? And so we were, for all intents and purposes, dating without the intentionality of, like, we're dating, we're in a relationship, right? And actually, John Paul II talks about this in Love and Responsibility, how there's, 2 types of attractions that you might experience with someone. There's like the sensual attraction, which is kind of like what we think about in terms of classic chastity. But he also talks about attraction of sentimentality, and where you might be emotionally attracted to someone. And this might be something that's like difficult for us to realize. And it took me a long time to kind of to recognize in myself. But you can, use someone emotionally just like you might use someone physically. And that's something that is really important to kind of keep in the back of your mind when you're maybe spending lots of time with someone of the opposite sex, like what's the intention behind it. And I found that, with these 1 or 2 guys that I was spending so much time with, I'd go on dates with these other, really great guys, but in the back of my mind, I was always maybe comparing them to that friend I had, right? But they're not quite like this guy. And so I wasn't dating this person, but they were taking up emotional space in my heart that was meant for someone else. And it was hard to give myself to someone else when they kind of had this occupancy in a place that they maybe didn't belong. So just something that I encourage you to think about with your friendships. This like idea of emotional chastity. We can talk about that more too later on. That's kind of my experience. We started dating. He was finishing up his master's, and I was about to go into my senior year of undergrad. And so we started dating. And I don't know. Do you want to talk a little bit about like our initial boundaries and stuff?
So along with the emotional chastity, which we often don't think about too much, the one that pretty much everybody thinks about is physical chastity, which is much more obvious, much more kind of, probably shouldn't be making out, watching a movie by ourselves at this time of night together, or things like that. The way that I try to look at chastity, this virtue, is simply as a rightly ordered relationship. So to be chaste recruits a lot of other virtues, right? We are prudent, we are courageous, we are wise, and it takes not just the virtue of chastity to have a rightly ordered relationship, but it also recruits all these other virtues in the process. So to have a rightly ordered relationship with somebody at every step, it's dynamic. It's not necessarily static. And what I'd like to maybe encourage you guys to take away too is that it's not something that stops when you get married. Marriage does not fix your problems. It doesn't stop your problems. If anything, it highlights how selfish you are, how self-centered you can be, and sometimes how weak you are. And marriage is actually the starting point for the rest of your life. And so chastity and these other virtues, especially during college, is a virtue to be, a habit to be practicing, because the habits and the virtues you take and you form now while you're in college will be the ones that you take with you into the rest of your life. And the older you get, the more difficult it is to change those habits. So now is the time to start kind of thinking about it. So for us, chastity, definitely meant having specific boundaries in terms of the time that we spent with each other.
Or just dating first.
Yeah. What did you have something specific?
So when we first started dating, we were in school, and so we were able to just spend a lot of time with each other. I mean, there were some days when we'd eat all 3 meals together. We would just spend a lot of time together.
That was after we had already said, so I guess maybe backtracking a little bit. So 3 weeks into kind of going on dates, we had noticed how much time we were spending with each other, how much we were kind of sharing of each other, and that's when we really, with the intention in mind of getting married, this is how we find ourselves now. We have to make a choice. Do we want to continue to do this or not? And so we had that conversation one night while we were at her house, just hanging with some friends, and we made the decision to start dating, to be in a committed relationship with that intention in mind. And so we had to start thinking about what we wanted the relationship to look like. And so some practical things, some days it was easier to kind of hold than others, but we had a time limit of we'd be out of each other's houses by 9 o'clock, for instance, and we just kind of had that time together, and then had that intentional sort of break.
Yeah, and we kind of our boundaries were very dynamic. As the relationship developed, so did our boundaries. So some things that we would do is we only allowed ourselves one little kiss a day until really we tried to do that until we got married, just because we found that you have to kind of put a hard defined stop on things. So being able to talk about these things too with your significant other is really important. Being able to bring up these conversations. So that was one of our boundaries. Another one was, like he said, a specific time of day, like by 9 o'clock, we won't see each other anymore. Like he'll leave or I'll leave. But we would also make sure that we were always like in open spaces together, because part of what, I really had to learn was, even if you have like the best intentions, you also have to make sure like you're avoiding the near occasion of sin, and how easy it is to just be putting yourself in the near occasion of sin. So like that was kind of how we formed our boundaries, was around that principle of avoiding that near occasion of sin. So during dating, I would say like those were our primary boundaries, and like they were, again, dynamic based on the ways in which maybe we had failed in the past, or things that we like recognized could be kind of like a slippery slope.
And with any of these practical things that we mentioned, I guarantee you we broke them at least once in the time that we've been together.
If not more than once.
But the boundary allows us to see where we have overstepped, right? And to be able to take it back. If we didn't have those boundaries, there'd be nothing to give us a reference point for, right? And for other people, it's going to be a little bit different, and it depends on where you're at, both in terms of your career, in terms of your spiritual life, in terms of your responsibilities, say to family or to friends, or organizations, that sort of thing. So with any of these, we have definitely broken them. Another, I'd say, important one that we talked about was when to really start talking about marriage, and how we would handle finances.
Kind of hearkening back to the idea of emotional chastity.
Right. So one of the things we had was, all right, we've got to both at least meet the other's family in person and spend time with them. We both, we gave ourselves kind of a time limit too. It was ideally 6 months. So we had from kind of this point in time to then to kind of date, to see each other in different places. That was another huge thing for us. And one thing that was probably one of the biggest pieces of advice I received was, when you're dating someone, try and spend as much time in different situations with different people with this person as possible. And then you get to see them in all these different scenarios. If you're doing, for Emily and I, we did ministry together. We studied together for sure. We hung out with each other's friends. And that was all part of the process. They helped to keep us accountable. And so we got to see each other in all these different ways at different times, kind of during the semester, how she handled stress in terms of exams, how I handled stress because I was working at the time. And so we really got a sense of what the other person was like in a lot of different situations.
And so, yeah, and it's important to think about these things, like why is it so important to have boundaries emotionally, physically, like what's the purpose of it all? And like he was saying, chastity doesn't like stop when you get married. Chastity is something that like you have to practice very intentionally in marriage. And really, like in any relationship, it's really important to have it in mind. And it's there so that you learn to love the other person and to give yourself completely to the other person and not to use the other person. And that's really the purpose of it all. And the sooner you're able to start practicing it with your friendships, with your dating relationships, the better off you'll be once you get married, if that's what you're called to. And even if you're not called to marriage, it's important to be able to live chastely in any state of life that you might be called to.
And so, yeah, the purpose, having the end in mind, which is why when I was dating, I had the end of marriage in mind. That was, again, a reference point for me, and it kept me kind of grounded. What was I doing? What was the point of marriage? What was the point of dating? It was to give of myself. It was about sacrifice. Marriage is a next step in the relationship. And so, people often talk about compromise, but I don't think that's right. Marriage is about negotiation, and it's about sacrifice. Compromise is something you do with your roommates. Who does the dishes when? Who cleans this up? what do we do about this situation? That's what you kind of negotiate with your roommates. If they don't do the dishes, you leave a passive-aggressive note, and you tell them to get their stuff together. If your spouse doesn't do the dishes, that's your responsibility. It's 100% your responsibility. So that's what you're practicing when you are living chastely, when you have the end in mind. It's about sacrifice, giving of yourself so that you grow. And so that's, again, the point of having chastity, emotional chastity, and physical chastity. Any other thing about our story? When we got engaged, that was tricky for us personally. So she was going back to Connecticut, and so in the summer of 2019, I was trying to figure out where to go, and so I didn't want to be away from her. So I moved to Connecticut to try to find a job there, and so that it would be easier for us to kind of work on the wedding. And so we were going to have the wedding in Connecticut with her family. It was her home parish, and then my family was just going to come from all over.
So originally he was just going to move up to Connecticut, and like he was temporarily living with my family while he like find a job, find a place. But then he was only going to stay there for like 6 months-ish. And if anyone's lived up north, like it is outrageous, the cost of rent, like outrageous. And he wasn't even going to be there for a full year. So my parents were like, just stay with us. Like, you're not even going to be here a full year. Like, don't even bother. So he ended up, we lived together before marriage. Would not recommend. I mean, it was my parent. I know father's like, where is this?
You know that one, huh?
But it was with my parents and I think 5 of my 7 siblings. So, who were in the house. Yeah. So.
It's not as
scandalous.
Yeah. I was given a mattress underneath a window in their schoolroom office for that span of my life.
So what happened was COVID happened and he got to spend an entire year with my family. It was awesome.
Yeah. And I was like pushed up against a bookshelf too, and her mom was gracious enough to
clear out
pull
part
out
of the bookshelf
and take the books off, so I had a little like space to put my things, and that's how I lived. And then, but it was only temporary, right? But then 2020 happened, COVID happened, and then trying to find a place. The reason it was going to be temporary was because she was going to physical therapy school.
We weren't sure where I was moving. Anyway, so when we were engaged though, I would say a lot of like the boundaries that we had still applied. It was just a whole lot harder. And if you spend a lot of like, if you're close in proximity with someone that you really care about, it can be challenging to maintain those boundaries. So we had to be even stricter.
More, yeah. So we had the same kind of boundaries. We wouldn't be alone in rooms together. We would not kind of spend too much time together in the evenings. We even had to have conversations with her parents just to kind of help us, again, keep ourselves accountable. But it was out of love for each other. We were trying to really live well with kind of the situation we found ourselves in. So I definitely wouldn't recommend it, again, because looking at her dad and talking about these things, was uncomfortable, to say the least, but it was necessary. And we grew closer because of it. So my in-laws are just the most amazing people, and I have the deepest respect for them. So it was actually something that allowed us to become even closer as kind of extended family. Yeah. So I guess that's
Sorry for the disjointed spiel, guys.
There's a lot more to kind of our story, but that's a good overview and some of our experiences.
Come out in the Q&A.
Yeah. We did get, I have the questions.
Oh, you do? Okay.
We did get from Kelly 5 questions that some of you guys sent anonymously. So I figured like we can answer those first and then we'll take any other questions that you guys might have. Okay. So ready? I got it right here.
You do.
Yeah, right here. So the first question is.
Back real quick.
For what?
Because it's just a screenshot.
Oh.
More. Yeah, a few more.
Oh, there's more. Okay. Well, then, want to read the first one?
So the first question that we've got.
Wait, scroll up a little bit.
The first question is. Let's see if I can. What are your thoughts on prolonged, passionate kissing? Usually I'm not thinking anything when that's happening, but no, I'm just kidding. Sorry, terrible joke. Terrible joke. No, well, I'm not sure the context, but it is entirely appropriate in the confines of the marital act.
But specifically that, so this is kind of harkening back to chastity in marriage, like, and something that you may not think about, but that's something that we wouldn't just because we're married, it's not something that like, oh, we're married, we can do this now. It has to be within those specific confines, because then otherwise it's not unitive and procreative, it's
Yeah.
use.
And so that's a big thing. So we are practicing what we are going to be doing for the rest of our lives. And so if you are passionately kissing somebody, and again, think about what kind of message that sends to them, to this other person that you are with. If you're dating, you're not sure that this will be the person that you'll spend the rest of your life with, if that's what you're called to. And so just have in mind, again, that end, right? What is the point of this? Is this passionate kissing, prolonged kissing, is that going to bring us closer together? Or is it just kind of feeding a more shallow sort of desire, more carnal desire for the other person? And that's, I guess, some of my initial thoughts, but did you have anything else? And Father, I don't know if you wanted to add anything?
You're doing well.
Okay.
Okay.
Gotcha.
I promise we didn't talk about this.
Yeah. And I mean, we did fall into that from time to time, and it was something to kind of watch. But again, you have the boundary so that it gives you a reference point, so you know when you are.
How far is too far, basically.
Exactly. So what are your thoughts on cuddling? Again, I love to cuddle. I think it's great. Not sure what else there is to say. Again, it's very similar to the passionate kissing, right? What is the end that we have in mind?
And I think too, with something like this, it's like, what's the circumstances? Like, what's the setting? Are you like sitting close to each other's arm around you, and you're watching a movie with your friends? That's very different from, you guys being alone, like in a private area doing that, because again, it's what's the near occasion of sin. Can
I nuance this question?
Yes.
So what would be your suggestions in the appropriate boundaries of PDA when it comes to dating?
Yeah.
None. No PDA. No.
So how that plays into public appearance and things like that as well.
Yeah, and
Right.
that's a good point too.
Well, and this is all, I guess, kind of in our personal experience, what has helped us, what we have regretted. I know for me, I have a lot of regrets in how I treated the ladies that I dated before I met Emily. There are things that I engaged in with these ladies that I wouldn't even talk about with them beforehand. And that's a big red flag, right? So if you're engaging in things with somebody that you wouldn't even talk about, in kind of conversation with them beforehand, then that's, definitely.
But specifically too about PDA,
Okay. Yeah.
I think one thing that's important to consider, if you're with your significant other, is you not only have a responsibility to them, but you have a responsibility to your brothers and sisters. And so you have to also think about, what am I portraying by, like holding their hand is one thing, but what am I portraying by insert what you're doing here? Because you have to consider like what scandal is. And scandal too is like, even if you're not doing anything scandalous, if you lead people to believe like, oh, they're Catholic and like they're doing X, Y, and Z, so it must be okay. Like you have a responsibility not only to like love the other person, but also love your brothers and sisters by how you are acting when you're around them. So I think that's also really important to consider.
And being a parent now, one thing that's constantly on my mind with any of my behaviors is, would this be something I would do if a 5-year-old were in the room?
And that could be a good point of reference, or like your parents, maybe like using that to kind of create like your PDA boundaries.
Yeah.
Is that good? Anything else? Okay.
what are your thoughts on hanging out in your partner's bedroom bed? No.
No.
Bueno. The bedroom, the bed is for two things, sleep and sex. That's what I learned. The Franciscans are very practical in their advice. So, in my formation and sort of in the talks that I had, that was a very helpful rule for me.
Because again, it's like going back to like, what's the near occasion of sin? Like, and I keep saying that because like this was something that we really had to work on ourselves, like especially when we were in the same house before we were married. That you may like have absolutely the best intentions, like you go into each other's room because you want to like pray a private rosary, right? But like you're still placing yourself in a situation where you may be tempted, and like you have an obligation to avoid situations in which you may fall into temptation. Yeah.
How did you decide on your boundaries?
I feel like we've been talking about that a lot.
Yeah,
A lot of like our own mistakes.
And I think we can. For me, I set my boundaries. That was how I approached it. So I have these standards for myself. Even before I was dating Emily, in my other relationships, because I knew my struggles, I knew my failings, my faults, and I was in communication with my friends, people I trusted, and so I chose these boundaries because it was something that. Because of the mistakes I had made, I needed the extra. I needed that sort of extra intentionality so that I wouldn't slip back. And one thing that was, I think, really beautiful that happened recently. Your friend Emily Coyle, she began, and now they're engaged, but she began dating this young gentleman a year and a half ago, I think. He was Catholic, but he didn't have the same kind of boundaries that she did. And he's a great guy. We've met him. He's a really solid dude. But when they began dating, she had to let him know and sort of explain, these are why I have these boundaries.
Like, I won't, they were long distance. So, like, I won't stay over at your place. Like, I'll get a hotel room.
Yeah. We won't do kind of passionate kissing. That's something that she was not going to be engaging in. And so she had to really have the courage, right, to have that conversation with this guy who she really liked. So that's also something to consider when you're setting boundaries, is you have them for yourself, and you need to have the courage to express those to your significant other or someone that you are potentially going to date. Can Catholics have oral sex in marriage? From my understanding, yes, as long as the procreative act is not thwarted, meaning that ejaculation has to occur within the woman. That's my understanding. I know that there is some debate about that in my mind. And I actually remember having like an hour-and-a-half conversation with a few of my friends in undergrad about this particular. It was
Also think emotional chastity, though. Are these debates you should be having? Just think about it.
With two girls and
Yeah.
two of my guy friends.
Maybe not one-on-one with someone of the opposite sex.
Right, because, there is sort of a,
I think for this, like, the church doesn't, like, really strictly prohibit it, but I think when it comes to these sorts of things, like in marriage, you really have to be doing regular self-examinations of conscience, and does this, like, when, obviously it has to, like, end in, like, the proper way, but does this lead me to, like, objectifying my spouse or not? It's something that you just have to, like, constantly be examining in your own heart, and that's like you kind of learn, but.
Well, and I remember that was something big that in the early 2000s, JP2 had said, that you can still lust after and objectify your spouse. And people were shocked by that. Like, what does he mean? Like, you can't objectify or treat your spouse like you can't lust after your own spouse. That's ridiculous. But it does happen. Those things don't go away just because you get married. And so for everybody, that's going to be up to your comfortability. Again, have these conversations with your significant other at the appropriate time, right, with guidance from another married couple, a priest, someone you trust. Oh, yeah, How can a woman let the man lead in a relationship while also protecting herself emotionally and physically? Great question. Yeah, wow.
I think the first thing that comes to my mind is make sure that you're actually with a good man, and that kind of goes back to what standards do you have for dating. So first of all, is he a good guy that you can trust? And then what's the?
How can a woman let the man lead in a relationship while also protecting herself?
And I think that, so yeah, step one would be having your own standards and criteria, and if he doesn't quite live up to those, then maybe reconsider the relationship, and also obviously being aware of red flags that might give you pause, but letting the man lead in a relationship is like a very interesting, I feel like that can be a whole other conversation, but letting him lead does not mean that you don't have a say in things, or it's still a dynamic mutual relationship of mutual love and respect, and so if it's lacking in mutual love and respect, if it's one-sided, then I would just reconsider the relationship. We can talk more on that if later if you guys want.
Yeah. She lets me lead all the time. I don't know that I'm in control, but at least I get to feel like I'm leading. So that's how we.
I'm kidding.
What would your advice be for a couple transitioning from dating in college to the professional world? Wow, yeah, another great question. I think that's very nuanced. For us, it was advice. I would say well, so I mean, we were engaged when we left college, so it was pretty clear, because again, I had her in mind. My career choices, my professional choices were going to be affected by that decision, because first and foremost, I was called to marriage. I wasn't called to be a therapist. That's not my primary vocation now. Marriage is. And so with that in mind, I made the decision to go live in the North. Not my first choice by any stretch of the imagination, but I convinced her to come down to South Carolina, so it was a happy ending. But you do have to make sacrifices depending on where you are in the relationship. If you're dating, that might be the time to ask the question, are we going to get married? If you're engaged, then the choice should be a little bit more clear. But again, it has to be sort of what is the purpose of this relationship in dating, and I think that was
or what's the advice
in college,
when
right?
transitioning?
Yeah. Did you have anything to say, Tad?
And just give each other grace, because it's a stressful transition. So if this is someone that you've been dating, like he's saying, maybe this is a good time to consider talking about marriage, maybe depending on where you're at. But it's a stressful time, so make sure that you're patient with each other, and trying to still intentionally get to know each other, intentionally date. It might look different, but I think a lot of the principles still apply. Just intentionally spending time together and discerning the vocation together.
Communication. The next one is, how do I get a boy to like me? Great question. Yeah.
Do you want to answer this?
Depends, for sure, yeah. Well,
This is for Connor.
how do I get a boy to like me?
Is this a joke question?
Well, I mean, you can.
Oh, baby girl.
I don't know about boys, but if you want a man to like you, then
There's
you
the
can really,
difference.
Sort of talk about
The standards that standards that you try to live up to yourself will be the type of person that's attracted to you. So try to live the way that you want the person who you'll be with to live. So.
And that again looks different for everybody, but
find your non-negotiables.
I can
try to live by them.
I can tell you that a virtuous woman was always the most attractive thing for me. When I first noticed Emily, it was in the chapel. She was praying after Mass, and I had this clear picture of her in my mind because I was helping out kind of in the sacristy and reading during the summer. But I just saw her praying after Mass every day, and I thought that was very attractive.
Because fun fact, we actually first met in the gym, and when I walked away, he literally thought, she's not my type.
Yeah.
So
So we had met before, and then at that time I was like,
it wasn't the gym, it was the chapel that did it.
Yeah. So maybe it's just the right time, right place kind of thing, you know? You just kind of have to be in the right light, that sort of thing.
It was a very flattering light.
Is that why you put yourself right underneath that center little spotlight?
It was very intentionally done.
You saw me.
Okay, sorry, keep going.
How can a woman signal to a guy that she's interested in dating without explicitly telling him? I feel like that's the opposite question.
She's interested?
Yeah.
What do you mean?
Than the other one. How do I get a boy to like me? How can a woman signal to a guy that she's interested in dating? Well, I guess it's the same question.
I would like to say it's okay to like tell a guy that you're interested in him. Like it's okay to be upfront about it, and that's really uncomfortable. But two of our good friends are now engaged because the girl had the courage to like tell him that she was interested, and that she really had feelings for him. But how would you do it without explicitly?
Just put yourself, out there. And what I mean by that is, if, again, it depends on the situation, but I would usually try to put myself in their path. So for Emily, that meant, is she done praying? Oh, time to go get my stuff. Kind of.
We both did that.
In the back of the chapel.
It worked.
Type thing. So maybe, just positioning yourself, right place, right time, and you do kind of notice where they are. If you like someone, you kind of notice, like, oh, I kind of met them on Monday at this time. Maybe they'll be in the same place. And, but yeah, I would agree with Emily. Just don't be afraid to say.
It's okay to give it time, but if like you guys maybe have been friends for a while and like there's been no change for a while, like don't be afraid to say something.
Yeah. Did you ever feel like you went into marriage faster than you would have because you wanted to be more physical? I think that's more for me than for you. Would you say? Our experience has been, that sex is different for men than for women, generally speaking. Not everybody falls into those categories, but I know for me, I was very excited. It's a good thing. It really is. We have this kind of weird thing in our culture where sex is at once liberating and also something that's dirty and we shouldn't talk about. But we as Catholics understand that it's a beautiful thing. It brings you closer to God. It brings you closer to your spouse. And it brings you children. And that's been a very magical thing for us. So yes, it was for me very exciting. Now
But I don't think it really
wasn't a central concern.
Influenced like the speed in which we did get like engaged pretty early on. I would say like only after 9 months of dating.
Yeah.
But I don't really think for us that was too big of a factor.
Yeah. It wasn't because we ended up having a 14-month engagement.
It's very long. Would not recommend.
I wanted to get married in December, but she was like, oh, maybe April, and then ended up being June, and the pandemic hit, and I was like, told you so. And I was like,
we're not bitter about it. It's fine.
Yeah, no, that is part of it, and that's not a bad thing. It's not a bad thing to want to be physical with your partner. It's a good thing. It means that you have recognized the beauty of God that God has created in them. So it's a good thing. But
I hope those adequately answer those questions, but we have like 10 minutes, I think, before we have to close up. So are there any other questions that you guys, I think Kelly has the mic over there.
I do have the mic. Yes.
So if anyone has like other questions, or if you want us to elaborate on any of those.
Thank you guys for talking. So something that I've been kind of wondering about is just thinking about chastity as part of temperance and like how it relates to, you talked a lot about like bringing other virtues in, right? And like they all kind of build together so you have an ordered life, like life properly ordered towards the good. And, it's interesting because, we group chastity with, it's under temperance. So it's like related to like, your moderation with drink and with like food. And, it seems like we talk about lust in a different way than we talk about like disordered hunger or like disordered thirst, or you know what I mean? Like it's not exactly the same. Like lust is in some way more significant, or even just like distinguishing between like attraction to somebody in a way that like hunger is like attraction to food and lust is like a sin and like gluttony is a sin. But this is just me rambling at this point. But is it just because like it's more serious because like we're more inclined to like abuse it to some extent? Like it's easier to, I don't know, like we have a higher tendency to do it, or is it because of like the object's much more serious, like it's a human being and not like a piece of food? I don't know if you could comment on that.
I think
about it.
totally, and that's
That was
such
my thought.
a great, that is like such a great point, because we say like, right, like to be like to want to overeat is, or like to have that desire is like, oh, that's not really sinful, but like we say to lust is like sinful. And I think it's like you kind of have to distinguish one between the like initial desire and then like cultivating that desire, which is different. But I think probably for what my first thought is the reason why that's so important is because like sex is supposed to be not only unitive but procreative. And so when it's abused, like not only you're hurt, the other is hurt, but now the potential for life has like been affected, right? So you, right, Sophia like is the result of it. And so like you're now not only like impacting yourself, the other, but like the potential for that child as well. So like I think that's probably why it's like so much more important. I don't know, do you have any other thoughts?
Well, we are sexual creatures, and that means that this does kind of cut right to the heart of, in a sense, our identity. And if, look around at the culture, right? What is everybody focused on, but we can't really have good conversations about is sex. People are so hyper-focused on their sexuality and how they identify sexually that they are incapable of it prevents them from touching on reality. So I would say that's a great question, a great point. But I think it does have to do with not just treating objects and yourself, but now you've kind of brought in another person, and then again the potential consequences are much graver.
Hello.
Hello.
Good. Y'all might have already touched on this, so completely skip if you did. But for both of you, marriage is a radical thing. When was the point when y'all were willing, yeah, I might give up everyone else for this person?
Well, I told them it was 3 weeks after meeting them.
Okay, you did share it.
It was like 3 months for me. But I think for us, one thing that was like important to keep in mind is like he was graduating with his master's, like I was already like finishing up undergrad, so we were already older and like already in that mindset of we feel really called to marriage, and so we're like actively discerning that. So for us, it didn't take very long. Like once we realized this is someone I can see myself marrying, like that, it was a very easy decision, I think.
I will say that for me, it's maybe not the most romantic thing to admit, but I thought that I felt that way several times before with some of the girls that I was dating. I did get rejected, and that's a hard thing to kind of do. You might be ready and willing to give yourself to somebody, but they won't necessarily reciprocate for a bunch of different reasons. So, so it's important to keep that in mind as well.
Maybe this will close it, but in your relationship and early on, I know you mentioned about seeing her pray after Mass, and this was very attractive to you, but as a couple, how important was the time? Was it to spend time together in prayer for each other and with each other.
That was probably the most important
It was,
aspect of
yeah.
our relationship, and still is.
We had a holy hour before we got married the night before, so we spent an hour in vigil. We really tried to make our relationship very prayerful, so as often as we could during our engagement, we prayed together. We did the Liturgy of the Hours together, we prayed the Rosary together, we went to daily Mass together, and that's still a priority for us today.
And it's so important too because you're discerning your vocation with this person, and so it's so crucial to just keep prayer at the center of it all, because I mean, really, like the purpose of marriage is like we're helping each other get to heaven, and like that's the whole point. And so if you take prayer out of the equation, then are you really fulfilling your vocation? So it's very important. Still is.
We probably have time for like one more question, if someone has one more.
Is it a good question?
Oh, I was just in general.
Oh,
It has to be a good
I thought you were gonna
question.
ask a question, so.
Oh, no.
We got time. Sophia's quiet, so now's the time to do that. Yeah. Okay.
Going once. Going twice. Okay. Okay.
If you could just comment on like what it was like in some sense to know that you were like called to marriage, like what kind of factors played into seeing yourself in that light, wanting that for yourself, that kind of thing.
Absolutely. I think one thing that's really important is I always had the mindset of I'm like discerning my vocation until I say my vows one way or another. And so for me, I never like had a specific discernment period where I was like religious life, marriage. But I tried to be like always discerning both kind of at the same time. And so for me, I would say for me, and maybe this isn't the best answer, but like I just felt a lot of peace when I prayed about it. And certainly when I met Jojo and I started dating Jojo, there is just so much peace, which really kind of helped to guide my decision. I think I was like most certain then when we started dating, just from the peace that came from the relationship. But
I think for me, I had more twists and turns in my journey, but it really, I remember the day, too, when I was walking the Camino, when I had a very spiritual experience. I won't go into it, or else I'll start getting emotional, but that was kind of a big turning point for me, was God really, in a big way, had spoken to me and said, at that point I was already kind of on the fence about priesthood. I had left the discernment program. I was kind of on my own, but I still wasn't fully committed to the idea. I was kind of waiting, and God did provide me with a very poignant experience as I was walking the Camino. So that was kind of the big turning point for me.
Great. Thank you guys so much. You guys had great questions. You guys had great answers, and thank you so much for sharing your story with us. And this concludes our session for this afternoon. And our next session will be next week. So, yeah. Thanks, guys.